A racist man spit near Big Shaq's car. An act meant to provoke, to mark territory, to remind. But Big Shaq didn't flinch. No anger, no words. Just a calm so heavy it shifted the street around him. What unfolded next wasn't loud, but it was unforgettable. Because in a world that expects fire in return, Big Shaq chose silence. And that silence left the racist man speechless. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was the kind of Tuesday that doesn't announce itself. No alarms in the wind, no signs in the sky, just heat sliding off rooftops, and the distant hum of downtown Atlanta rolling like background music through Edgewood's old bones. Big Shaquille O'Neal, or Big Shaq as the kids called him, around here, had spent the morning in his usual low-profile routine, mentoring teens at the rec center off Boulevard, helping them navigate school, dreams, and the silence between them. He didn't dress like a celebrity, no entourage, just sweats cap low, sneakers heavy, and grounded like the man himself. He wasn't here to be seen, he was here to serve. As he stepped out of the center and moved toward his black Escalade, a deep, polished beast of a vehicle parked near the curb, he paused. The kind of pause that's almost instinct, not fear, awareness. A man was crossing the street from the opposite sidewalk, mid-60s, unshaven, long faded leather jacket despite the heat, eyes scanning but not seeing, until they locked on Shaq. That moment didn't stretch. It snapped. The man didn't break stride. He didn't speak. He just moved to the curb, turned slightly toward the SUV, and spit. The glob landed near the front tire, close, intentional, surgical, not on the car, but close enough to mark territory, close enough to send a message. And then, like nothing had happened, he kept walking. Shaq stood still, one hand on the door handle, one foot on the curb. He didn't react, didn't shout, didn't chase. He watched. There was something about the act, the calculation in it. This wasn't random. It wasn't rage. It was something colder, a quiet kind of violence, the kind you couldn't scrub off with soap. He opened the door, slid inside, and sat there for a moment, not looking at the spit, not even looking at the man walking away. Just breathing. His size made the car look smaller, more contained, but inside a storm was forming, one that didn't need thunder. Shaq had seen this kind of thing before, not just on streets or in locker rooms, but in boardrooms, interviews, brand meetings, and private dinners. The spit wasn't new. It had just changed form over the years. Sometimes it was a word mispronounced on purpose. Sometimes it was a backhanded compliment. Today it landed as saliva. Tomorrow, it might be silence. But here's the twist. The city was watching. Not in the way of crowds or camera phones. No, this part of Atlanta felt. The street had its own memory, its own conscience. It remembered when Shaq personally funded the repairs to the library roof. When he paid for 8 students' community college tuition without ever taking credit. When he showed up at a neighborhood funeral unannounced just to support a grieving mother he didn't even know. These weren't headline acts. They were heartbeat acts. Edgewood didn't need TMZ to tell them who Big Shaq was. And so, when that spit hit the pavement, something shifted. A ripple, quiet but wide, moved down the block. A pair of teenagers sitting on milk crates near a bodega noticed. A barber sweeping up hair inside his shop caught it in the corner of his eye. A little girl holding her mother's hand outside the laundromat paused mid-sentence. No one said a word, but they felt it. Back inside the Escalade, Shaq pulled his cap down a little lower and turned the ignition. The soft rumble of the engine filled the cabin, but still he didn't drive. He just sat, not in fear, not in confusion, but in calculation. Shaq wasn't built for impulsiveness. Not anymore. The younger version of him might have gotten out, said something, made a scene, but this version, shaped by decades of being misunderstood, of being praised and punished in the same breath, he'd learned the weight of waiting. He understood that sometimes the loudest response was none at all. But don't mistake silence for surrender, because in that moment, a seed was planted, not of revenge, but of something more dangerous, curiosity. Who was that man? Why now? Why here? What did he think that spit would do? And most importantly, what would it mean not to let it slide, but also not to react the way the man expected? Shaq's phone buzzed. Just a message from Verity over at the community center. Thanks again for today. The kids were really listening. See you Thursday. He typed back a quick always, then glanced up at the street where the man had vanished. Nothing but heat waves and cracked pavement, but the mark remained. He put the car into gear and eased into traffic, not speeding, not distracted, just alert. Aware now that something had shifted in the frequency of the neighborhood. Something subtle, but undeniable. A story had begun, and the spit wasn't the climax. It was the prologue. That night, he parked in the garage beneath his building and stared at the concrete wall for a full 10 minutes before going upstairs. No TV, no music, just a quiet apartment, and the hum of a man retracing the frame by frame of a 5-second incident that wouldn't let go. He wrote a single sentence on the notepad by his kitchen counter before heading to bed. Sometimes it don't take words to be screamed at. He didn't need a plan yet. He needed perspective. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't about saving face. This was about something deeper. This was about who still felt they had permission to spit, to dismiss, to remind. The problem wasn't just the man. The problem was the world that made that man feel comfortable doing it. The next morning, Shaq returned to the same block. Parked in the exact same spot. No reaction. Just watched. For now. Because sometimes, the only way to find out how deep the poison runs is to watch where it spreads. He wasn't hunting. He was listening. And when giants listen, the world gets nervous. Once upon a time, not so long ago, but long enough to feel buried, Grant Whitlow's name meant something on the south side of Atlanta. His grandfather built Whitlow Tools from the ground up during the post-war boom, a time when being a white man with grit in a shop was enough to carve out a legacy. 3 generations ran it like a kingdom, father to son, son to grandson. And when it came to tools, hammers, torque wrenches, socket sets, everyone in the neighborhood knew, if it came from Whitlow's it wouldn't break. But time is cruel to those who build walls around the past. When the city approved a highway expansion 15 years ago, Whitlow Tools was one of the first to go. The government offered compensation, called it revitalization. They even handed Grant a printed letter with the city seal and a signature that looked machine-made. He didn't care about the money. He cared about the dismantling of history, one bulldozer at a time. And that new shopping complex that opened 2 miles away, swallowing small businesses whole, had a flashy hardware retailer, funded by an athlete-run investment firm. The glossy banner over the entrance, powered in part by O'Neill Development Group. Grant never said it aloud, but in his gut, the bitterness turned personal. He watched from the window of his apartment above a tired pawn shop, drinking black coffee out of a cracked mug that still read Best Boss, 1997. Day after day, he saw the world evolve without asking his permission. The faces on billboards changed. The voices on radio stations shifted. The corner bar now served avocado toast and cold brew. And worst of all, the people he used to feel comfortable around were becoming outnumbered. In his eyes. Not just in the streets, but in the stories being told. So when he heard that Shaquille O'Neal himself had quietly funded a community bookstore in Edgewood, Grant didn't feel impressed. He felt provoked. He never read the news articles that praised Shaq for giving back. Never watched the clips where he handed out Christmas gifts or funded scholarship programs. To Grant, Shaq wasn't a philanthropist or a gentle giant. He was a reminder, a 7-foot shadow stretching over everything Grant had lost. A man from a different world, wearing success like armor, walking through neighborhoods like they still belonged to people like him. Grant didn't see Shaq as a man. He saw him as a symbol, one that didn't ask for permission to rise. In his mind, the spit wasn't an attack. It was a statement. A line in the sand. He had grown up believing that power wore work boots and calloused hands, not championship rings and tailored suits. But now, even his anger felt outdated. That's what aided him the most. His rage no longer echoed. It just rotted. The apartment Grant lived in wasn't his. It belonged to his cousin, who let him stay after the shop closed. The walls were thin, stained with nicotine. His belongings were few, a dusty photo album, a pair of work gloves he couldn't throw away, and a drawer filled with unused resumes. He had tried once or twice to re-enter the workforce, but the world didn't want men like him without degrees or digital skills. They wanted fast, polished, compliant. He spent most of his days drifting. Sometimes at the diner, sitting in the same booth by the window. Sometimes walking by the community centers, scoffing at the murals painted by children who would never know what it meant to build something with their hands. To Grant, those kids weren't being uplifted. They were being indoctrinated into a future that didn't need him. And then came that Tuesday. That breathless, sunlit Tuesday. He hadn't planned it. He didn't wake up thinking, I'm going to spit near Shaquille O'Neal's car today. But when he saw that Escalade parked on the curb, shiny, defiant, proud, he knew whose it was. Everyone in the neighborhood did. Shaq never advertised his presence, but his frame, his reputation, and the ripple effect of his kindness made him instantly recognizable, even without a jersey. Grant crossed the street not to confront, but to declare, in his own bitter, silent language, that one wet act was meant to reclaim space. He didn't look back after it landed. He didn't need to. In his head, he'd already won. What Grant failed to understand, what he couldn't have possibly prepared for, was that Shaq noticed, and Shaq remembered, not just the act, but the posture, the expression, the small tremor of satisfaction in Grant's gait, as he walked away. That wasn't power. That was decay pretending to be defiance. Back in his apartment that night, Grant replayed the moment more than he cared to admit. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, sat in the faded recliner his father once napped in, and looked out the window at nothing. He wasn't proud, but he wasn't sorry either. In his eyes, the world had wronged him, and all he had left was the right to remind it he was still here. There were layers to Grant, ones even he hadn't fully unpacked. Deep inside, beneath the cynicism and stale anger, there lived a young boy who once stood on a stool beside his grandfather, learning how to fix a broken latch. That boy had been patient, kind, eager to learn. Somewhere along the line, loss had mutated that boy into a man obsessed with control, and when the world refused to be controlled, he chose resentment over reflection. He wouldn't have called himself racist. Most people like him never did. But his instincts betrayed him. The words he didn't say were louder than the ones he did. The spit wasn't about territory. It was about identity, about someone trying to resurrect a version of America that only ever existed in his memory. But time doesn't pause for nostalgia, and streets don't forget injustice just because it comes without slurs. That single act, a spit near a car, wasn't forgotten. Not by the man it was meant to humiliate. Not by the community it quietly insulted. Not by the corner of the city that had watched Grant shrink into himself like a ghost trying to haunt a home that no longer welcomed him. What Grant didn't realize that day was that his action, though small, had lit a match, but not the kind that burns buildings, the kind that exposes shadows. Shaquille O'Neal had built a life not out of spotlight, but out of silence, not out of spectacle, but out of service. And when he watched Grant that day, watched the walk, the spit, the stubborn pride, he didn't feel anger. He felt clarity, because some men shout to be heard. Others whisper and change the whole conversation. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace. It comes from decision. Not the kind you make with a gavel or a raised voice, but the kind you make in your bones, when all your instincts scream to speak, but your soul says wait. That's the silence Shaq carried with him. The day after the spit. Not the silence of surrender. The silence of calculation. The morning had rolled in heavier than usual. The sun wasn't hiding, but the city felt hushed, as if waiting. Shaq didn't take his usual route to the rec center. Instead, he circled Edgewood slowly, windshield catching the glare of streetlight residue. He wasn't hunting, not exactly, but he was looking, observing, leaning into the patience that had built him. And when he spotted Grant, same scuffed boots, same leather jacket, same slow swagger, he didn't speed up. He parked a block down, watched him move with that unearned entitlement. Grant crossed into a small corner diner that looked like it hadn't changed in 30 years. Shaq waited until the door swung shut before stepping out. Inside, the air was thick with grease and low-volume radio fuzz. Booths with cracked vinyl and tabletops that stuck to elbows. It was the kind of place where regulars drank their mornings bitter and talked about the past like it was a wounded pet. Shaq walked in slow, head low, cap tilted. The waitress behind the counter gave him a brief glance, recognition flickering but not spoken. He moved to the booth behind Grant and sat down without a word. He didn't order, didn't take off his cap. He just leaned back and listened. Grant had taken his spot like a man who'd never once questioned if it was still his, slid into the booth like gravity owed him. His voice carried just enough to make itself known. Black coffee. Hot. And don't let it sit. The tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't even angry. It was weighted. Like he wasn't ordering coffee. He was demanding recognition. The waitress scribbled and nodded, already used to the cadence of men like that. From behind him, Shaq sat still, one hand resting on the table, the other on his thigh, his ears tuned in, not just to words but to temperament. He wasn't looking for confrontation. He was gathering context. This wasn't about what Grant had done. It was about what had built him. The layers of bitterness, the years of slow erosion. Shaq wanted to understand what it took for a man to weaponize a single act of disgust. Casual, calculated, and entirely his. Grant muttered to himself occasionally, nothing coherent. Sipped his coffee like it insulted him. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the kind people carried before phones ruled the world. He flipped through pages filled with what looked like figures, dates, maybe scribbled ideas. Nothing in that notebook would explain the spit, but it whispered of a man trying to rewrite relevance, even if just for himself. Shaq thought about all the rooms he'd been in, the board meetings where smiles hid daggers, the interviews where compliments felt like cages, the way some people celebrated his size but shrank from his shadow. Racism didn't always knock down the door. Sometimes it sat behind a coffee cup and sighed loudly. He'd seen it dressed in luxury, coated in pity, cloaked in laughter. But this was different. This was raw, not subtle, not systemic. Just a man, untethered, and looking for someone to blame. Shaq didn't stay long. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Just enough to watch the rhythm, the breathing, the loneliness hidden inside defiance. Then he stood, quietly, and left the diner without the bell above the door even catching attention. Outside, the air had shifted. The city felt like it was watching again, but not judging, just listening. Back in his SUV, Shaq leaned back in the driver's seat. He wasn't angry, not the way people might expect, not the way the world expected men like him to be. He wasn't thinking of revenge. He was thinking of intention. What would it take to make a man like Grant not just notice him, but see him? Not the fame, not the money, not the size, but the humanity. He remembered what his mother Lucille had told him as a child. People don't always throw fists. Sometimes, they throw silence. And silence can bruise too. So Shaq didn't make a statement on social media, didn't call out racism in capital letters, or fire off a clever post. He let it breathe. Let the story write itself a few pages further. Because sometimes, when you speak too soon, you interrupt the truth as it reveals itself. That afternoon, instead of heading home, he made a quiet stop at the bookstore he helped fund, the same one Grant had walked past a dozen times without stepping inside. He didn't go in. He stood across the street watching. The mural on the side of the brick wall, painted by local kids, shimmered in the sunlight. A swirl of faces and colors and words like hope, and build, and listen, words that dared to be louder than hate. Shaq took a breath. He knew what he was going to do next. He wasn't going to confront Grant. He was going to invite him. Not with words, with actions, with presence. Because when someone spits near your car, they're not just trying to disrespect you. They're testing who you are when nobody else is watching. And Big Shaq? He had nothing to prove. But he had everything to teach. The sun had dipped just enough to throw longer shadows across the sidewalk when Shaq returned to his car. The kind of hour where the city begins to shift. People rushing home, streetlights yawning awake, tension rising with the hum of rush hour. He approached the Escalade the same way he always did. Slow, composed, and observant. But this time something was different.
There it was.
A single, folded piece of paper tucked tightly under the windshield wiper, not flapping in the breeze like an ad or a parking ticket. No. This had weight, intention. The way it sat there stiff and sharp at the edges told Shaq everything he needed to know before he even touched it. He pulled it free gently, unfolding it with the kind of care you give something you don't trust. The handwriting was jagged, the ink heavy from pressure. 4 words, in all caps, screamed from the page without exclamation. You don't belong here. No name. No threat. Just a sentence soaked in cowardice and laced with venom. No context needed. It was crystal clear, straight from the gut of someone who didn't just see Shaq as an outsider, but as an invader. He stood there for a moment, paper in hand, traffic buzzing behind him, like white noise. A jogger passed by, headphones in, oblivious to the stillness wrapping around the giant man reading hate on a piece of folded paper. It wasn't the first time Shaq had been targeted. But this felt different, smaller, pettier, but no less pointed. And yet he didn't crumple it. He didn't rip it, curse, or toss it into the gutter. Instead, he opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and placed the note carefully into the glove box, beside napkins, a pair of sunglasses, and an old church program from a friend's funeral. He tucked it in like it was something sacred, not because it held power, but because it revealed a truth most people only whispered about behind doors and under breath. It wasn't just about him. It was about what it still meant to exist in public while Black, successful, and unapologetically rooted in service. Shaq had built his career on presence. Not the kind that shouts across arenas, but the kind that makes a room lean forward without realizing. He knew what this note was. A flare. A signal. Someone was afraid. Not of what he would do, but of what he represented. The kid from Newark, who'd grown into a man too big to ignore, a man who had refused to be bitter, who'd made his money but never left a block behind, a man who still walked through his neighborhoods like he had something to give, not something to sell. Hate doesn't always come in screams. Sometimes it folds itself into corners of paper and slides under wipers in daylight, hoping to wound without confrontation. But what the writer of that note didn't know was this. Shaq had long since developed an armor forged from patience, not pride. He didn't need revenge. He needed understanding. And more than that, he needed strategy. He started the car, the low purr vibrating through the seats, and stared out through the windshield. The note still echoed in his chest, not because of what it said, but because of how familiar it felt. It was a reminder that for some, no amount of service, success, or kindness could ever soften the rage they held for those who dared to belong. As he pulled out onto the street, a quiet idea began to form. Not a plan, not yet, but a vision. He wasn't going to respond in the way whoever wrote the note expected. He wasn't going to rally, retaliate, or make a scene. No, he was going to do something more difficult. He was going to let the moment expand. Give it space. Let it breathe long enough to reveal its source. He thought of the kids at the rec center, of little Kelvin with the sketch pad, of Verity, who kept the programs running even when the budget said otherwise. He thought of the bookstore, of the mural being designed for its side wall, still in rough outline. These were the reasons he didn't fight fire with fire, because sometimes the most radical thing you could do in the face of hate was build something that didn't burn. That evening, in his apartment, Shaq pulled the note out again. He placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it under the soft overhead light. It looked even smaller now, just a scrap of paper pretending to be a weapon. But inside it he saw everything. Resentment, fear, loss, denial. Someone had tried to deliver pain in a sentence, but instead they had handed him direction. The note became more than just an insult. It became a compass. He grabbed a legal pad and began to write. Not a response, but a reflection. Questions first. What does belong mean? Who decides it? How do you prove it to someone who's already decided against you? And then answers began to take shape. Not in declarations, but in opportunities. There wouldn't be a confrontation. Not the kind the note begged for. There would be a response they couldn't prepare for. Something that would hold a mirror up, not just to Grant, if it was even him, but to the entire street. Because the real victory wouldn't come from calling out the cowardice. It would come from revealing the roots of it. And that Shaq knew required patience, precision, presence. As the night deepened, he folded the note again and placed it back in the glove box. Not hidden, but not displayed. It would stay there, untouched until the time came to use it. Not to hurt, but to heal through exposure. Because the man who left that message thought he was setting boundaries. But Shaq didn't live inside their lines. He walked past them, through them, around them, and sometimes he erased them entirely, without raising his voice. He just kept showing up. The youth center stood like a heart in the middle of the block, unassuming but alive. Every brick in its walls had a story, painted murals from community days, scuff marks from kids learning to dance, a roof that had been patched more times than anyone could count. Shaq had put more than just money into it. He had invested hours, sweat, presence. It wasn't his name on the door, and he liked it that way. But everyone in the neighborhood knew who kept the lights on. At 11:47 p.m., the fire department responded to a call. Flames licking the sky from a metal bin, pressed against the back alley wall of the youth center. It wasn't big enough to do structural damage, and no one had been inside at the time. But it wasn't random. Fires like that don't start themselves. especially not in a bin filled with soaked flyers and cardboard from earlier that afternoon's art program. It was more message than mayhem. By 12:30 a.m., Shaq stood outside the taped-off alley, arms crossed over his chest, jaw locked. Verity was already there when he arrived. Her cardigan wrapped tightly around her, eyes still wide with disbelief and something just short of fear. Could have been worse, she said quietly, almost as if saying it louder would tempt fate. Shaq didn't answer right away. He was staring at the soot-blackened brick, the singed edges of the mural they'd just begun outlining 2 weeks ago. A part of a child's name, Naomi, now looked like it had been erased mid-word, as if someone was trying to rub the identity right out of the wall. A police officer approached, clipboard in hand. "We've got partial footage from the street cam," he said. "Not clear, but there's a person leaving the alley right after the fire ignited. The limp's noticeable." Verity looked at Shaq sharply. They both knew who had the limp. That slow, dragging leg from the diner. The same shuffle Shaq had tracked with his eyes, as Grant Whitlow walked away from the spit. The pieces didn't scream, they whispered. But they whispered loud enough. "Do you want to press charges?" the officer asked. Shaq exhaled slowly, then turned to Verity. "We know who it is," she said, reading his thoughts before he spoke. "It's time, Shaq." He looked back at the mural, at the ruined corner of something meant to bring color and belonging. Then he shook his head. "Not yet," he murmured. "Let the fire show us who's cold inside." Verity didn't agree. Not fully. But she trusted his instinct. She always had. Shaq never rushed the wrong moment. He waited until it cracked open. The next morning, the story had already made quiet rounds. Not front-page news, but murmurs between shopkeepers. In the halls of the high school, whispered over coffee in the bodega. A fire by the youth center? That wasn't coincidence. It was a signal, and the neighborhood had learned to read signals fast. But the message landed differently than intended. No one blamed the center. No one talked about closing it down. Instead, a group of parents showed up that afternoon with cleaning supplies. Kids gathered to repaint the mural's burned corner, and by sundown, Naomi's name was back. This time in bolder color. This wasn't just resilience. It was resistance. Shaq watched from the far sidewalk, arms crossed again, eyes quiet. He didn't tell anyone about the footage. He didn't need to. The alley had spoken, and the limp had told a story all its own. That evening, he met Verity at the community center office. The two of them surrounded by paperwork, broken crayons, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. She placed a tablet in front of him, paused on a single frame from the security camera, the back of a man barely in view. But the stance, the jacket, the leg, they were unmistakable. "We've got him," she said. "We can bring this in officially. This is a line crossed, Shaq." But Shaq just sat there staring at the image. "Lines crossed don't always need fences," he said. "Sometimes they need mirrors. You're still trying to reach him." "I'm trying to reach through him." Verity didn't answer. But something in her softened. Maybe it was the weight of knowing Shaq had seen worse fires than this, and survived them without smoke on his hands. Later that night, Shaq took a walk through the neighborhood. No hood up. No disguise. He wasn't hiding from anything. He moved slow, the way giants move when they don't want to shake the earth. Kids waved from stoops. An old man nodded from a corner chair. And when he reached the back alley of the youth center, he stopped. The fire had left a mark, a permanent one. Even after the cleanup, the brick was darker in that one spot. Scarred. But scars tell stories. And this one whispered. They tried to break it. It didn't break. Shaq stood there a long while, letting the silence speak louder than sirens. This wasn't just about Grant anymore. It was about how people like him, afraid, fading, furious, could still strike matches, hoping the world would burn with them. But what they forgot was this. Some buildings weren't just made of brick and paint. Some were held up by presence. And presence, when it's earned, becomes fireproof. As Shaq turned to leave, he made one decision. He wasn't going to chase Grant with consequences. He was going to corner him with truth. Not because he believed Grant would change, but because the community deserved to see what hate looked like when it was stripped of its disguise. And for that to happen, the next move had to come from within the light, not the shadows. The next day arrived with a heaviness that the sky couldn't hide. Clouds hung low like they were bearing witness to something unspoken, something pressing just beneath the surface of the city's skin. The fire from the night before hadn't scorched buildings, but it had scorched something deeper, a sense of safety that took years to build, and only seconds to shake. Yet the youth center opened its doors like always, defiant in its routine. Inside, the smell of markers and fresh printer paper filled the air, clashing gently with the dull scent of ash that still clung to the back hallway. Shaq arrived just before 3. He didn't come in like a savior. He came in like a regular head low, steps steady, presence unannounced but unmistakable. A few kids noticed and whispered excitedly, but he didn't play into it. Instead, he found his way to the art room, where colored pencils scratched against paper, and children sat hunched in concentration. These kids didn't know about the note under his wiper. They hadn't seen the footage of the man with the limp. They didn't understand that their sanctuary had nearly been taken from them. What they did know was that Shaq was here, and when he was, the space felt safer. Verity gave him a nod from the corner, and slipped back into her paperwork. Shaq took a seat in one of the tiny plastic chairs, too small for his frame but just right for what came next. That's when Kelvin walked out. 8 years old, hoodie 2 sizes too big, notebook clutched in both hands like a fragile secret. His eyes wide and serious locked on Shaq's for a second before he held out the sketchpad. No words yet, just the offering. Shaq took the notebook gently, flipping it open to the most recent page. What he saw stopped him. The drawing wasn't perfect in proportion or detail, but the emotion was exact. A giant stood at the edge of the page, hands stretched out like a wall, holding back a massive wave that curled and twisted with angry lines. Behind the giant, tiny stick figures worked together, building a city, lifting beams, planting flags, holding books. The city wasn't finished, but it stood tall just beyond reach of the wave. Shaq looked up. Kelvin still hadn't said anything, but his eyes spoke for him. "I drew you," the boy finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "You hold back the angry part of the world." There was silence in that moment. Not emptiness, but depth. The kind that stretches between two people who understand something without needing to explain it. Shaq smiled. It was soft, genuine. But behind that smile, there was weight. Not just pride or gratitude, but hurt. Because what Kelvin had drawn wasn't fantasy. It was a reflection. And reflections tell the truth whether you're ready for them or not. "Do you like it?" the boy asked. Shaq nodded slowly. "I do. A lot." Kelvin grinned, pleased. He took his sketchpad back and wandered off to find more colors. Shaq remained in the tiny chair a little longer, staring at the blank space on the page next to the drawing. He didn't need to fill it. It already said enough. What Kelvin didn't know, what he couldn't yet grasp, was how much truth he'd captured in those crooked lines. For all the community saw in Shaq, mentor, builder, protector, there was a cost. It wasn't just the hours or the money. It was the constant pressure to be composed, to carry grace when others threw shade, to smile through discomfort, to model dignity for kids like Kelvin, even when the world tried to rip it from his hand. That pressure wasn't imaginary. It was real. And in moments like these, Shaq felt the weight of it curl around his ribs. Because he was tired. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix. The kind that came from years of holding back, a tidal wave of justified anger. Anger at the spit, at the note, at the fire, at the fact that even now, after all he'd done, someone still felt the need to remind him. You don't belong here. But he did belong here. Not just because of who he was, but because of what he represented. He was more than a giant holding back water. He was a bridge between what had been and what could be. And yet the unspoken truth lingered in his chest. If he ever let go, even for a second, if he let the anger flood out, the world wouldn't blame the wave. They'd blame the giant. They wouldn't remember the fire someone else set. They'd only remember the moment Shaq raised his voice. They wouldn't see the hate folded into windshield notes. They'd only see the headline, "Shaquille O'Neal snapped." So he held the line. Later that afternoon, as kids filed out of the center, backpacks swinging and laughter echoing down the hallway, Verity came to sit beside him. She'd seen the drawing. She didn't say anything about it, just offered him a cup of tea and let the silence stretch. "You know," she said after a while, holding it all in, being the wall, "it's holy work. But it's also heavy. You don't have to carry it alone." Shaq nodded, but he didn't respond. Not because he disagreed, but because he didn't know how to share a weight he'd been lifting so long. It had fused to his spine. Verity placed a hand on his shoulder, gave it a gentle squeeze, then stood to leave. The lights flickered once as the center powered down for the night. Shaq stayed behind for a few more minutes, walking the halls like a silent guardian. He paused near the mural wall, where the fresh paint still glistened from the kids' repair work. Naomi's name was back, bigger this time, bolder. Before stepping out into the night, he glanced down at his hand. Kelvin's drawing was folded neatly in his palm. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket, not to protect it, but to carry it close. Because sometimes when the world tries to make you the enemy, a child reminds you who you really are. Not a threat. Not a target. Not a headline. A giant, holding back the angry part of the world. One quiet breath at a time. The morning after the fire, Edgewood moved like a city holding its breath. The streets weren't silent, but they weren't lively either, just quiet enough for the sound of tension to settle between footsteps and car horns. Word about the fire had traveled, and so had the rumor. Everyone had an idea of who might have done it, but no one said his name. Grant Whitlow walked through it all, like a man untouched, as if the alley hadn't lit up behind him 2 nights before. He bought his coffee from the diner like always, tipped the same wrinkled dollar, and stared out the window with that same distant disapproval of a world that refused to look like him anymore. But that afternoon, something broke the routine. At precisely 4:17 p.m., Grant opened his front door to the sharp click of his mail slot. No footsteps. No doorbell. Just a single, white envelope sticking halfway through like a quiet dare. He stared at it for a moment before tugging it free and examining the front. No return address. Just his name, written in strong, deliberate handwriting. Inside a single sheet of cardstock, cream-colored, printed in bold black letters. Open mic night. Stories from the block. Friday. 7 p.m. No cameras. No politics. Just truth. At the bottom, smaller and hand-scrawled in pen, "Come sit," or "Come speak." Grant stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the invitation like it was written in another language. His instinct was immediate. Crumple it. Toss it. And he did. Mostly, it landed in the trash can near the door, resting atop yesterday's paper and a few coffee grounds. But as the evening crawled in, so did something else. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, a kind of pull. The kind of quiet question that starts whispering when the house gets too still. What if it's about you? Friday came fast, as it always does when you try to ignore it. By sunset, the neighborhood was shifting. Cars lined the blocks, near the bookstore. Lights flickered on behind windows. People moved towards something with purpose. Not just curiosity, but hope. Inside the shop, folding chairs were packed tight, forming an uneven semicircle around a makeshift wooden stage. No higher than a curb. There were no velvet curtains, no spotlight, just a single standing mic, and a soft lamp near the back. The air smelled like paper and peppermint tea, laced with a nervous energy that clung to every wall. The crowd that gathered wasn't clean-cut or monolithic. It was a mosaic. Young poets in hoodies, elder women in church dresses, teens with skateboards, retired teachers, street vendors, a couple in designer coats, a homeless man with half a tooth and more wisdom than Twitter could hold. Black, white, Latino, mixed. Stories from the block meant everyone on the block. The only thing they had in common was truth. Shaq arrived through the side entrance, not to make an entrance, but to preserve the flow. He greeted no one, made no speech, just took a seat in the second row, knees to his chest, hands resting over one another like stone. He was here to listen before he spoke. Grant didn't mean to show up. At least, that's what he told himself when he found his feet leading him toward the shop just after 7. He lingered near the edge of the sidewalk for a while, pretending to check his phone, pretending not to be watching who was coming and going. But then someone held the door open for him. He hesitated, then stepped inside before he could talk himself out of it. No one turned to look. No one pointed. No one seemed to care that he was there, and somehow that made it worse. He took a seat near the back, close to the shelves, eyes scanning the room like a man expecting confrontation. But what he saw unsettled him more than any angry face might have. He saw vulnerability. People taking turns at the mic, telling stories raw and unfiltered. A teenager spoke about losing his brother to the prison system. A young woman shared a poem about her mother's resilience and her own resentment. An old man recounted how he'd been evicted after a bank error no one cared to fix. Each story was its own truth, and yet each one braided into the next, forming a tapestry that didn't need applause to be real. Shaq didn't go up early. He waited. Let the room breathe. Let the silence settle after the 12th speaker stepped down, voice trembling but proud. Then, slowly, the giant rose from his seat and walked to the mic. He didn't adjust it, just leaned slightly forward. And then, without fanfare, he spoke. He didn't call out names, didn't refer to the fire, or the note, or the spit. What he did was tell a story. He told them about a man who walked with a limp, not just in his leg, but in his soul. A man who used to own something, but lost it. Not just a business, but his place. And how that man, instead of reaching out, chose to reach backward, trying to grab a world that no longer wanted to hold him. He told them about the spit, not what it was, but what it represented. A stain, not on metal or glass, but on the man who delivered it. A mark of pain left unprocessed. He paused, letting the weight land. He said, some people leave bruises without ever touching you. But those bruises, they show who they are, not who you are. And then he said, the line that made Grant's breath stop in his chest. But the worst damage is what we do to ourselves when we refuse to see each other. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Shaq nodded once, stepped away from the mic, and returned to his seat. No one clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because clapping felt too small. In the back, Grant sat frozen, his mouth dry, his stomach tight. It wasn't an accusation. Shaq had never looked at him, never spoken his name. And yet Grant felt exposed, as if the story had peeled something back in him he hadn't realized was still raw. He didn't get up and leave. He stayed until the last story. He didn't speak, didn't even stand when the crowd began to disperse. When he finally did rise, he didn't go out the front. He slipped through the side door like a man trying not to wake something sleeping inside himself. That night, as he lay in bed, eyes open, Grant replayed the story in his head over and over. It wasn't just what Shaq said, it was how he said it. With no bitterness, no superiority, just clarity. For the first time in years, Grant didn't feel like the victim of a changing world. He felt like a spectator in a world that kept growing while he stood still. He thought of the note he'd left on Shaq's windshield. He thought of the fire. He thought about what it meant to come sit versus come speak. And he realized, maybe for the first time, that sometimes the most painful truth is realizing you've been the villain in someone else's story, and no one even had to tell you. They just held up a mirror. It was 3 days after the open mic night when Shaq finally slid the USB drive across the table to Verity. No ceremony, no explanation, just a small gesture that said, now's the time. They were sitting in the back office of the youth center, where the coffee always tasted burnt and the clock on the wall ticked louder than it should. But that room had seen the weight of every decision, every silent crossroads, and this moment added another layer. Verity plugged the drive into her laptop, the screen flickering before the footage loaded. The room went still as she pressed play. The camera angle wasn't perfect, it caught only the far end of the alley behind the center. But there it was, grainy black and white. A figure stepping into view, moving slow, a limp in the left leg, head down, familiar coat, familiar stance. The man didn't look around. He simply approached the trash bin, reached into his pocket, and with one flick of a lighter, lit the fire. He stood there for a moment, watching it take, watching the smoke curl upward. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. Verity paused the video at the exact frame where the man's face came briefly into the light. Her breath caught. Grant, she whispered. Shaq didn't flinch. He'd known. From the moment the footage had landed in his inbox. From the limp. From the timing. From the way the air shifted around Grant's name every time it passed through a conversation. But seeing it confirmed was still something else. Verity looked at him, eyes narrowed. We have to do something. Shaq nodded slowly, but then said something that made her pause. We are. She tilted her head. You're not going public with this? No press. No police. Not yet. Her voice dropped. He committed arson. He committed grief. Shaq replied quietly. Anger's just how it dressed that night. Verity stared at him. You really think he can come back from this? Shaq shrugged. I think most people don't know how to ask for help. So they set fires hoping someone finally sees the smoke. She leaned back in her chair, sighing deeply. Then what do we do? Shaq looked out the window, where kids were chalking colorful drawings on the sidewalk. He didn't answer immediately. He watched them laugh, play, reclaim. Then he turned back. We give him something worth protecting, he said. Something bigger than his pride. And that's when the mural began. It started as a quiet conversation between Verity and a few trusted community members. Then it turned into paint cans, brushes, and outlines on brick. There was no funding campaign, no press release. Just a wall at the side of the youth center, previously charred and scarred, now being prepped for a transformation. The vision was simple: let the kids paint what the neighborhood meant to them. Not the city, not the map, but then, one by one, they came. With sketches and ideas and colors that didn't follow any rules. A girl painted her grandmother, holding a Bible. A boy painted a subway car, filled with people of every shade. One corner became a city skyline, with beams made of books. Another became a pair of hands holding a basketball and a diploma. It wasn't neat, it wasn't symmetrical, but it was alive. Shaq didn't paint anything himself. But he showed up every day, brought sandwiches, refilled water jugs, lifted the younger kids to reach higher spots. He stood back and let them shine. Because this wasn't about him, it was about what grew from the ashes, what was rebuilt after someone tried to burn it all down. News spread in whispers, the way good stories do, when they don't beg to be told. Grant, whether he wanted to or not, heard about it. He passed the youth center twice that week, always on the opposite sidewalk, always pretending not to look, but he looked. And every day, the mural grew longer, louder, more defiant in its joy. Then came the part no one expected. On a Thursday afternoon, just before sunset, a young woman named Kyra, barely 20, asked if she could add something near the center, something bold. She didn't sketch it first. She just dipped her brush in deep red paint and began working in long, deliberate strokes. The shape took form slowly, a giant figure standing behind the city, arms stretched out wide, blocking a wave that threatened to crash it all. It wasn't Kelvin's exact drawing, but it echoed it. Grown up, bigger, stronger. The neighborhood saw it for what it was instantly. Shaq. By the time she finished, the giant's eyes were open, steady, not angry, not sad, just watching. Protecting, unshaken. Verity sent Shaq a photo of it later that evening. He didn't respond, but he saved it as his phone background that night. 2 days later, something changed. Shaq arrived early, before most of the kids. The street was still yawning awake, and the paint was still drying on the edges of the mural. He parked across from the center and stepped out, stretching a bit, coffee in hand, and that's when he saw him. Grant, standing on the sidewalk, not moving, not hiding, just watching. He didn't approach, didn't say a word. His hands were buried in his pockets, his shoulders hunched like a man, unsure if he belonged in his own shadow. Shaq didn't move either. He let the silence hang. After a minute, Grant turned and walked away. But this time he didn't look angry. He looked smaller, like something in him had finally run out of reasons to stay bitter. Shaq said nothing about it to anyone, not even Verity. But inside he knew, the footage had done its job. Not by exposing Grant to the world, but by forcing him to see himself. That night, back in the office, Verity asked if they should erase the footage. Shaq shook his head. Keep it. She raised an eyebrow. Why? Because some fires deserve to be remembered, he said. Not to punish, to prevent. And with that he closed the laptop, stood up and walked outside into the cool air, where the mural stretched like a heartbeat against the wall. Mural born not just from creativity but from choice. The choice to build instead of break, to reveal instead of ruin, to forgive but never forget. The project was meant to be simple. That's how Verity pitched it. A block-wide mural project to give the kids something to build, something to own. But nothing on that block had ever stayed simple for long. Not pain, not progress, not paint. By the end of the first week, what began as a local art activity turned into something much larger, something that hummed with purpose. The mural wasn't just a painting, it was a living record, a stitched-together declaration of everything the neighborhood refused to let be erased. Each section of the wall was assigned to a different group of kids. Some from the youth center, others from the nearby high school, even a few who hadn't stepped foot in a classroom in months. No questions asked, no applications, just space, paint, and the quiet freedom to say this is ours. Verity stood back and watched it unfold, like someone guarding a secret too beautiful to interrupt. She didn't micromanage, she didn't give themes, she just made sure the paint stayed stocked, the brushes stayed clean, and the kids stayed fed. The rest took care of itself. The drawings came fast and loud, bright streaks of orange blues that bled into purples, spray can lines carved like poetry into brick. One kid painted the old bodega on Pine Street, immortalizing the place where his uncle taught him how to count change. Another drew a corner stoop with 4 stick figures playing cards beneath a boombox, a visual love letter to a summer that hadn't happened yet. A girl painted a tree with roots reaching into books, music notes growing from its branches. And in the center, unplanned but agreed upon without a single word, the giant appeared. No one said it was Shaq. No one had to. The scale gave it away. The arms wide like a shield, the posture quiet, firm, enduring. Behind him, the painted wave crested with tension, frozen mid-surge. But it didn't reach the city. It couldn't, not while he stood there, holding it back with the kind of silent strength that didn't need to shout. There was no name under the figure, no initials. But kids would point and say, "That's big," or "That's the wall," or just nod with a knowing look, like they were in on something sacred. The mural didn't need signatures. It was built with recognition, not credit. And then came the day Grant walked past. It was a Monday afternoon, the kind that feels like it's holding its breath between seasons. He wasn't supposed to be there. At least not according to the version of himself he still clung to. The version that stayed angry, stayed distant. But something about the footsteps carried him further down the block than usual. Maybe it was the rumors. Maybe it was curiosity disguised as routine. Whatever the reason, Grant turned the corner and found himself standing directly in front of the mural. He didn't move for a long time. Didn't blink. Didn't scoff. He just looked. And the thing that hit him first wasn't the wave, or the skyline, or the colors. It was the giant. It stopped him cold. Not because it resembled Shaq, but because it resembled something Grant had long stopped believing in. A protector. Not one who enforced with force, but one who absorbed impact, who held space, who stood between chaos and creation. There was something in the stance of that figure that made Grant feel exposed. Like someone had taken the guilt he carried, the fire he lit, the note he scrawled, and turned it into a mirror. A quiet one. One that didn't judge, just reflected. He stepped closer, pretending to study the details. But his eyes didn't track the brushwork. They stayed fixed on the giant's face. The artist had left it simple. No pupils, just the shape of eyes, set in calm, open expression. But Grant could feel the gaze. For the first time, he didn't feel defiant. He felt seen. One of the youth center kids, maybe 12 or 13, noticed him from the steps. She didn't recognize him as that man. To her, he was just another neighbor. She waved and said, "Cool, right? That's our wall now." Grant nodded stiffly. "Yeah," he said, barely finding his voice. "Yeah, it is." He left before the conversation could go any further. But he didn't walk like he usually did. Not with that stiff, purposeful swagger. This time, it was slower. Like his body was waiting for his mind to catch up. That night, back in his apartment, Grant sat in the dark longer than usual. He didn't pour himself a drink. He didn't turn on the news. He just stared at the spot on the wall where a mirror used to hang, removed years ago, because he hated what looked back. The mural had brought the mirror back, not to show him who he'd been, but to ask him, gently and without force, "Who do you want to be now?" The next morning, he passed the mural again. Slower. No flinching this time. He paused for only a second, but long enough for a child walking by to say, "That's the part I painted." Grant nodded. "It's good," he said, and he meant it. He didn't say more. He didn't need to, because the wall didn't just display stories, it witnessed change. Shaq wasn't expecting anything that night. He had driven over late, after hours at the center, and a long detour helping move supplies to a nearby shelter. His routine was the same. Park without drama, sit in silence a moment longer than necessary, and breathe. But when he stepped out of the Escalade, something caught his eye. An envelope, tucked under the windshield wiper again. Not flapping, not aggressive, just there, waiting. He paused before reaching for it, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. That first note, "You don't belong here," had arrived with tension, with heat. This one sat like a whisper, light and still. He pulled it free and unfolded it carefully, like he already knew it wasn't the same kind of message. Inside was a single line, no greeting, no name. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." That was it. No punctuation, no explanation, no return address. Just 7 words handwritten, in a way that tried to be steady but couldn't quite hide the nerves behind each curve. The pen pressure varied, betraying hesitation. It had taken effort to write, that much was clear. Effort not in the hand, but in the heart. Shaq stood still, reading the words again and again. He didn't look around. He didn't scan the shadows for a figure watching from afar. He simply folded the note back up and held it in his palm, like something breakable. No signature, but it didn't need one. Some letters carry a weight, heavier than names. This one wasn't about identity. It was about accountability. Whoever wrote it, and there was no doubt in Shaq's mind who had finally stepped through the door of acknowledgement. Quietly, privately, but fully. It was the kind of gesture that didn't erase what came before. The spit, the fire, the hate-soaked note. None of that vanished with an apology. But apologies, when real, don't seek to erase. They seek to redeem. Not publicly, not performatively, but personally, soul to soul. Shaq walked to the passenger side, opened the glove box, and reached past the emergency kit and half-used napkins until his hand found the other note. "You don't belong here" was still folded sharply, edges crisp like the wound it left. He placed the new note beside it, not to cancel it out, but to complete it. One, the spark. The other, the smoke curling away. He didn't frame the apology, didn't laminate it, or take a picture. This moment didn't need to be preserved. It needed to be respected. Later that evening, sitting in the quiet hum of his apartment, Shaq thought about how the story had begun. A stranger spitting near his car, a note meant to provoke, a fire meant to destroy. And now, an ending that wasn't loud. That wasn't even conclusive, just different. He remembered something Lucille, his mother, once told him when he was a teenager. Growth doesn't always sound like cheering. Sometimes it's the silence after someone finally puts down the weight they were never meant to carry. That's what this note felt like. A laying down of something heavy. The next day, Shaq didn't tell anyone about the letter. Not Verity, not the kids, not even Kelvin, who'd begun drawing new murals in his notebook, each one more vivid than the last. Shaq didn't need to share the note for it to matter. Because what made it powerful wasn't how many people saw it. It was how one man had chosen to face himself. And in a world constantly calling for receipts, proof, and spectacle, that choice stood out. The block kept moving. The youth center buzzed. The mural drew foot traffic and smiles, and Instagram posts. People came by just to take it in. Even the mayor's office called to ask who painted it, how to replicate it. But Shaq always gave the same answer. The neighborhood painted it. That's all. Grant didn't show up the next day. Or the next. But on the third morning after the letter, Shaq saw him. Not face to face. Not in conversation. But across the street, seated on the edge of a bus bench, watching the kids paint a smaller mural on the utility box next to the center. His coat was different, cleaner, his beard trimmed, his body still hunched slightly, but something about him seemed less guarded, less armored. He didn't speak. Shaq didn't wave, but their eyes met. And for the first time, neither one looked away. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It was recognition. Shaq went about his day, spoke to the kids, checked in with Verity, restocked supplies. As he passed the mural, he paused for just a second, long enough to glance at the giant in the center, still holding back the wave, still protecting what stood behind him. But now that wave looked different. Not like a threat, more like a memory. By evening, Shaq returned to the Escalade. The windshield was clean, no envelopes, no messages, just moonlight, reflecting off the glass, like a quiet pat on the shoulder. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, pulled open the glove box again, and looked at the two notes, one filled with rejection, the other with responsibility. Both, part of the same story. He didn't smile for long. But he did smile, because in a city where stories get lost, twisted, or buried, this one had written itself cleanly. No courtrooms, no headlines, just a moment where someone finally chose to be human again. And in that, there was peace. Not resolution, but peace. There were no camera crews outside the youth center the week after the mural was finished. No microphones, no flashing lights, no reporters chasing a quote. The block didn't trend on social media. There wasn't a viral video, no dramatic before and after reel to feed the algorithm. And yet something monumental had happened. Not in the headlines, but in the hearts of those who lived closest to the truth. Shaq's story, the whole arc of it, from the spit to the fire to the note that tried to cut him down, never left the block. It was never uploaded, never live streamed, never packaged for clickbait, because Shaq never needed it to be. He didn't turn the moment into a movement, he turned it into a message, written in silence, spoken through presence, carried by the people who witnessed it firsthand. Inside the youth center, a quiet shift took place. The kids, those who once spoke in distractions, cracked jokes to hide their fears, or looked down when challenged, began to echo something new. You could hear it when a boy caught himself mid-insult, and instead of lashing out, pulled back and said, "Nah, I'm chillin', be like Big." Or when a girl being bullied didn't retaliate, but stood tall, met her bully's eyes, and walked away with her head high. Later she whispered to Verity, Big wouldn't waste breath on that. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't even something Shaq had taught directly. It was something the kids absorbed by watching. He never gave them a speech about morality, never stood on the stage with a list of rules. What he gave them was an example of what it meant to hold your strength without crushing anyone else, to take a blow without returning one, to win in a way that didn't require someone else to lose. In the weeks that followed, Verity started calling it the quiet ripple, a subtle shift in how the youth responded to conflict, a gentleness that hadn't been there before, but now showed up in surprising places. A group of teens cleaned up graffiti on their own initiative. A high school senior wrote a piece for the community bulletin titled, "The Man Who Didn't Clap Back." A mural tour started among younger kids, walking new students along the wall and explaining what each piece meant, with the giant in the center becoming something of a mythic figure. The phrase "be like Big" started catching on, not because it was trendy, but because it fit. It meant standing without stomping. It meant showing up without showing off. It meant knowing when to stay silent, not because you were weak, but because your strength didn't require proof. The city's officials never heard the full story, not the mayor's office, not the council. They saw the mural and nodded politely. They offered grants and asked for media kits. But the core of it, the tension that built, the moment of potential rupture, and the quiet redirection, never made it to their inboxes. Because the truth is, this kind of story isn't built for the news. There was no villain brought to justice. No viral villain being cancelled. No righteous fury captured on shaky phone footage. What happened here required patience to understand. It required context, memory, a sense of lived experience. And that kind of depth doesn't make good headlines. But the people on the block? They knew. They saw what happened when someone tried to turn hate into kindling, and failed. They saw what it looked like when a man chose not to fight back in the way the world expected, but instead held space until his silence became a mirror. Grant didn't disappear, but he changed. He stopped lingering at the edges of the mural, and instead started walking by without flinching. He nodded at the youth center staff when they passed. One afternoon he even picked up a dropped box of juice cartons outside the center without being asked. He didn't speak, but the gesture said enough. The man who once left spit and fire in his wake had, in some small way, begun to thaw, and while no one celebrated it, no one ignored it either. Shaq never claimed credit. In fact, when Verity brought it up one evening, half-jokingly calling him the quiet mayor of Edgewood, he just laughed once and said, "I just wanted to keep the kids safe. That's it." But it wasn't just that. What he had done, deliberately or not, was redefine power for the community. Not as control, not as revenge, but as the ability to guide a moment without needing to dominate it. As the ability to reshape the trajectory of pain into perspective, not punishment. There was one more moment, small, almost invisible, that captured this new energy. A 10-year-old boy named Theo, notorious for starting classroom arguments, stood on the basketball court after school, clutching a ball while another kid called him a name meant to hurt. For a second, Theo tensed up. Everyone expected him to throw the ball, to yell, to swing. But instead, Theo took a breath, smiled just slightly, and said, "It's cool." He passed the ball to someone else and walked off the court. Later in the hallway, Verity asked him, "That was big of you." Theo shrugged. "Big don't fight every fight." Then he grinned. "Big just keeps playing." Shaq never heard that moment directly, but it found its way to him, like all true stories do. Not in a parade, just in passing. And when it did, he nodded once, and whispered under his breath, "Good." Because this story wasn't about him. Not really. It was about what he left behind. Not applause. Not sound bites. But legacy. The kind built one quiet choice at a time. The kind that never makes the news, but changes everything anyway. The road to Lucille's house hadn't changed much over the years. It still wound through that quiet stretch of suburbia where the lawns were uneven, porches creaked under the weight of memories, and wind chimes told the weather better than any forecast. Shaq could drive it blind if he had to. Ever curve memorized, not because of GPS but because of rhythm. Because coming home had a sound. A certain stillness that greeted you before you ever knocked on the door. It was a Saturday afternoon, sunlight softening across the pavement, the kind of day where the world seems to pause just long enough to let a man breathe. Shaq pulled into the narrow driveway and sat in the Escalade for a moment longer than usual. The mural, the letter, the kids, the neighborhood, Grant, the silence. It all sat in his chest like packed luggage. He didn't come to unpack it all, but part of him needed to know if he'd done the right thing, and Lucille O'Neill had always been the mirror that didn't flinch. When he stepped onto the porch, she was already there, seated in her favorite chair with a folded blanket across her lap. Even though the day was warm, her gaze met his, like she'd been waiting. "Took you long enough," she said, half a smile playing at the corner of her mouth. Shaq bent down to kiss her cheek. "Had some things to carry," he replied. She nodded, patted the seat beside her, and waited for him to sit. He did. No ceremony, no shield, just mother and son, and the hum of a neighborhood that had watched them both grow into different versions of the same strength. He didn't rush into the story. He let it come slow, like truth does when it's not trying to impress. He told her about the spit, about Grant, about the diner, the note, the fire, the open mic, the mural, the second note. Lucille didn't interrupt once. She just listened, eyes steady, hands folded over the blanket like prayer. When he finished, he didn't ask her what she thought. He just exhaled like someone who'd held their breath too long and now wasn't sure what to inhale next. Lucille looked at him for a long moment, then said the kind of thing that sticks to your bones. "You didn't let the world make you loud, baby. You let it make you clear." Shaq turned to her. "Was it enough?" "It was everything," she said. "And you knew it would be, even when you didn't want to admit it." She leaned forward, fingers touching his. "People think giants are made from noise, from shaking the ground when they walk. But the real ones, the real giants, they're the ones who make space for others. The ones who whisper and the whole room still listens." Shaq didn't cry. He never did, not since he was a boy. But something in him softened, bent inward, not from pain, but from the release of carrying something heavy too long. They sat like that for a while, no more words needed. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the porch lights blinked on, Shaq stood and kissed his mother's forehead. "You coming by the center next week?" he asked. "If I don't," she smirked, "you'll just send a car anyway." He grinned. Exactly. He left her house with the kind of peace that didn't come from resolution, but from recognition. She didn't tell him what he wanted to hear. She told him what was true. Back in Edgewood, dusk blanketed the block in gold and gray. Shaq didn't drive past the mural by accident. He made the turn deliberately, windows down, music off. The center was closed for the night, but the street still held its breath like it was waiting for him. He parked across from the mural and stepped out slowly. There were no kids tonight, no parents, no press, just him and the wall. The mural looked different at night. The colors weren't loud. They were deep, softened by the shadows and washed in amber light from the street lamp above. The waves still curled behind the giant, and the skyline still rose in defiance. But there was something almost holy about the way the figure stood, arms outstretched, body between danger and hope. Shaq crossed the street and walked along the length of the mural. His hand, massive and sure, brushed the brick as he passed each painted memory, the hands holding books, the tree with the music notes, the bodega, the giant. When he reached the center, he stopped. There was no plaque beneath the figure, no initials, but he didn't need his name on it. Everyone already knew. He stood there a moment longer, letting the quiet seep in, and then he smiled. Not the kind of smile for cameras. The kind that lives in the corners of a man's face when he knows he didn't take the easy path, when he knows he carried something ugly and didn't let it rot him, when he knows he left something behind that can't be torn down. He stepped back from the wall, took one last look, then turned to leave. No bodyguards, no interviews, no noise, just a man, larger than life, walking into the night, not as a spectacle, but as a statement. Because sometimes, the biggest giants whisper the loudest. And sometimes when they do, the world finally learns how to listen. If this story made you pause, don't scroll past it. Carry it. In a world that rewards noise, choose to echo clarity. Build where others burn. Listen where others spit. And when the moment comes to stand tall, be the giant who doesn't need to roar to be heard.